Hello ladies and gentlemen, Nick here, and welcome to my ranking of Doctor Who Season 5 stories. It's taken me a little bit of time. It took me a little bit longer than I thought. It took me about 2 weeks to get through the entire season, as opposed to a little bit shorter than I thought it was going to be. But then again, six episode stories apart from the first one, and I'm getting less time these days, although I might get a bit more time on the Wednesdays, on the Thursdays now, but not so much on the, but now I've not got so much time on Sundays nor on the Mondays, or at least, well, not as bad on the Sundays anyway. But yeah, so anyway, so let's dive, not for a good couple more weeks anyway, but never mind that. Let's dive into the Season 5 ranking. Now this time there's only going to be 7 stories and no honourable or dishonourable mentions. So just 7 places. No honourable or dishonourable mentions to bring up, and no, and only 7 stories. And so last couple ones were 8 or 9 or 10, and at least 1 honourable mention. So let's begin this ranking with, I'll just tell you which episodes we've got. We have the Tomb of the Cybermen, the Abominable Snowmen, the Ice Warriors, the Enemy of the World, the Web of Fear, Fury from the Deep, which is the first story since Mission to the Unknown, I believe. No, from Mission to the Unknown, not to have the at the very start of the story title. And last but not least, we have The Wheel in Space. Also, by my calculations, the next story not to have the in the title will be in the John Pertwee era, Spearhead from Space. So yeah, only one for the Troughton era, and it's this one. Crikey. Okay, so let's get into the ranking. Starting off with number 7. Now, this story I found boring, dull, uninteresting, pretty poor script, not very good characters. The villains were piss poor. Even though they become when we see them in later stories, they are better done. But in this story's case, they are poor. And they're not really ones I would have wanted to see back if it wasn't for the fact that they improved on the characters later on in further stories. And I am of course talking about the Ice Warriors. Yeah, every story that the Ice Warriors appear in from this point onwards, they get better as characters. We get to know a bit more about them. They get better plans. They have more reasons for what they're doing. We even get some nice ones in some stories, and a mix of both in other stories. But for this story, for their very first stories, they're just Daleks on legs and not that good. Not as good as the Daleks. Christ. They are awful in this story. And what's worse, the story isn't very good. Their plan isn't that great. The side characters aren't that great apart from Penley, but that's because Peter Sellers is playing him. And Peter Sellers is awesome. R.I.P. He's Wallace after all, and from Wallace and Gromit, so yeah. Character motivations can go back and forth all the time. That woman from that works at the research centre or whatever it was. Her motives keep going back and forth. Some of them are just or get just so headstrong motives that they just followed them to the extent, like that Scottish guy who was with Penny. And this is the weakest. Is it the weakest performances of our main characters? Deborah Watling is her weakest performance, but I think Patrick Troughton and Fraser Hines continue to give strong performances. I will say Deborah Watling is one of the stronger actors of this story, alongside Peter Sellers, Troughton, and Hines, and maybe the guy who plays the boss character. He's not that great of a character, but he's okay compared to what we get in some characters later on. But he could have been better as well. And oh god, that scene in part 5 where everybody's shouting all over each other, and then someone just abruptly stops it, and some of those people are just still really annoyed about it. God, can we not do that again, please? Wait, yes you are? Oh shit. Well, probably they will. Probably will again. I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, and the music is also pretty awful in this story. God, shut up! And do you need to take a minute to reveal that it's called The Ice Warriors and say which episode it is and who writes it? Oh, God. I don't mind the title cards, but when you're just taking up about half a minute just telling us the story title, the writer, and which episode it is... I will say they don't have to recap the stories because of that. So that's a plus. But nevertheless, The Ice Warriors is awful. It's not awful enough to get lower than a 5 out of 10, unless those animated episodes were awful. And awfully animated, they just managed to pass at 5. If they had been worse, or if they weren't good enough to save the story, then it would have been a 4. I was very close to giving it a 4, actually, but I think, well, I would now anyway. But I think the animated episodes, just about as they were, managed to save them. If they were set like the ones by... if Planet 55 had done the animation in it, then it probably would be a 4, probably even lower if it was like the Reign of Terror. But Queros managed to do a very good job with the animations of the 2 episodes. I think they did a great job. They're the best 2 looking animated episodes since Power of the Daleks. Or at least the latter half of Power of the Daleks anyway. So, Queros, give yourselves a round of applause for a good job well done and being one of the more positive things about this story. But overall, Ice Warriors is just bad. It's very bad. It's not my least favourite Troughton story at the moment, but it's certainly one of the weakest. And it's the weakest of this season, so that's why it's number 7 on the list. Number 6, on the other hand, is a little bit better, but I don't really enjoy it that much. There's a few good moments, but I can't get myself into it. And that is Fury from the Deep. Victoria's last story, and this is the story with Troughton and Hines' weakest performances. Although I think Watling does better in her final story. P.S. There's a little bit at the end that is recapped at the start of Wheel in Space. So I forgot to mention in that review. But this story just doesn't really interest me that much. I tried, but apart from a few good moments like the introduction of the sonic screwdriver and the helicopter scene in part 6, there isn't really that much goodness. Robson is one of my least favourite characters to date. And the Dutch guy, one of my favourite characters of the story, disappears after part 4. I think he should have done at least one more episode. He should have gone in part 5, and I don't know if he's even survived. I don't even know if he survived the story, and he should have popped back up in part 6 if he didn't. Or actually kill him off, confirmed that he's dead. So, yeah. And he wasn't the most terrible likeable character, but he was more likeable than bloody Robson. And one of the more likeable characters of the season, just because he called Robson out quite a lot as well. So yeah, that helps. But still, and I think the supporting characters that get introduced in the second half of the story are pretty good, like Megan Jones and her assistant. But overall, the villain is poor, and its motives are poorer. And its explanation of how it's there, well, I can understand that there's a new mutation of seaweed coming from possible gas leakages or something environmentally notable. But how seaweed can develop a mind and attempt to possess people, knock people out with funny gas, infect them with seaweed on their creatures, take over them, cause this funny foam stuff. All that, and spread the gas across space, everything. How are they doing it? Seaweed. How is it doing it? It doesn't make sense without an alien element. There must have been something to cause this seaweed to have a mind of its own and be able to do all of this. This doesn't make sense. I can understand maybe radioactive seaweed or something. Maybe it's causing them to mutate into creatures like the Primoids in Inferno. But as it is, it's absolute nonsense. And this is, I know it's science fiction, but this isn't. This element is supposed to be science fact, so it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense, and this is also what I can't disband my disbelief for. I can't even enjoy it. It's silly, and it makes no sense. But if it was enjoyable, silly, then maybe I wouldn't have so much of a problem with it. But it's not. It's boring. It's boring, silly, makes no sense, and contradicts my point of it's science fiction, emphasis on the fiction. But this time round, I can't agree with myself, because for starters, it's supposed to be science fact, and second of all, it's just way too silly. Give me fish vampires from space any day. Number 5. Number 5 is a bit more of a likeable story, despite being still a little bit dull, but it's likeable in a way. I mean, get through the first couple of episodes and you'll get a pretty decent, if slightly dull, no, very dull story. The Abominable Snowmen. Okay, with this one, I said in my review that there was no motive for what's going on, but later I found a motive and I added that into the review. The Great Intelligence, I think I also mentioned it in the Web of Fear review, that the Great Intelligence is looking for a body, so it decides to take the body of the Master, not the Master, but a Master of the monastery, and doing something to somehow get his mind into this body, and it's terrifying the monks. Yeah, this isn't that fun. It's interesting to see the characters try and work out what's going on, for a bit, but in all honesty, there isn't a huge amount of enjoyment. It's more likeable than the last 2 stories I've mentioned, but overall, it's just dull. It's not that interesting. It would have probably been better as a 4 or 5 part story. It probably would have been. By the way, as we're going along, each of the 6-part stories at their position of ranking are also, I also say each one as we're going along, as each story is, the better stories, I would say, are deserving of the number of episodes, or would be better with a higher number of episodes than whilst the lower place ones I think really ought to be very low ones. Like Ice Warriors I think should have been 2, Fury from the Deep in this one should have been 3 or 4, and we'll get to the rest in a bit. But I don't think this one is particularly that fun or interesting. I think it's okay. It's more of a prequel to the Web of Fear. It feels like a prequel, although it comes before, so it's more of a prologue. To be honest, it's a prologue to the Web of Fear. It's basically set up for a better story coming along, and yet the Web of Fear was probably just asked to be there by the right producers, by the producers for the writers to write another Yeti and Great Intelligence story that serves as a sequel to this story, but to have it as the 5th story so that they can get Victoria out of the picture and introduce Zoe and see the Cybermen back again at the end of the season. So the Web of Fear has to come 3 stories after the Yeti and Intelligence's first appearance. So, yeah. Then the same happened with the Cybermen, to be honest, with the moon base after the 10th planet. Although that one was 4 stories? Yeah, 4 stories afterwards, so a bit more time for Kit Pedler, or was it Jerry Davis, or both, to write a sequel. And even then, it wasn't a direct sequel like this Web of Fear is to this one. Speaking of which, number 4, The Web of Fear. Now, I was wondering whether it should be this one or The Wheel in Space, which one should be 3 and which one should be 4. I eventually settled, this one had been originally 4th and Wheel had been 3rd originally. By the way, Fury from the Deep had originally been 5th and the Abominable Snowmen had been 6th, but they swapped after doing. But besides that, I think the ranking's been pretty much the same since before, minus a score change there for 2 stories. One of them staying at the same place and the other one going down. No, 2 score changes, but one of them staying the same. 2 of them staying the same, and one of them going down a spot. Abominable Snowmen was the other one that was one of the score changes, as was Fury, and that one went down. And there's one more score changer that stayed where it was, but we'll get to it in a minute. But The Web of Fear, I think, is a good, interesting story. It has a couple of fun moments, and it's got some great stuff. I think it's a bit too long, again. I think it would have been better at 4 or 5 parts. But it's still interesting to see what's going on. The London Underground is used fantastically here, thankfully. They didn't actually go into the actual tunnels, they built sets, of course. Although the Underground did think, oh, you filmed on the Underground without permission. Of course, they didn't really. Otherwise, they probably would have been electrocuted. But yeah, it's probably the most realistic underground railway sets, at least for the show. I don't think there's that many, to be honest. But yeah, it just looks really great and has some great stuff going on. It's just a shame it takes its time to get round. And I forgot to mention this in my review. It uses some music from the Tomb of the Cybermen when the Cybermen are bursting out of their tombs. It uses that for the battle against the Yeti. Where was it that where it was taking place? Okay, I think was at Covent Garden. Yeah, Covent Garden was where we had the battle scene between Colonel Lethbridge Stewart, later the Brigadier in the next season, where he goes on to where he fights the Yeti above the ground, and that's where the music from the Tomb of the Cybermen plays, by the way. So that's, yeah, it's a bit strange that they used Tomb of the Cybermen music for a Yeti battle. In that scene. I think it's in part 4. Yeah. Oh, it's not part 3. I can clearly see. And yeah, so strange. But The Web of Fear, it's still pretty good. It's still a very good story and has some good moments. And it has the better of the reconstruction episodes by, I can't remember his name, but he also goes on to do the Underwater Menace parts 1 and 4, and those 2 were shit. So out of those 3, this is his best one. He also does the ones for the streaming Wheel in Space reconstruction, the 1, 2, 4 and 5 of the reconstruction on a streaming service. But again, as I've mentioned several times, no comments on that one as of yet. If it comes to DVD, then, or if it's on BritBox, then I get BritBox, which is unlikely, but or it gets shown on the telly or on YouTube, then I might. Better if it was on DVD. Just release it on DVD already. It came out in 2017 on the streaming service. Just release the Wheel in Space reconstruction on DVD already. It's not difficult. Just give us some more. Just give us some extras and some BBC consent, and then it's an official release. Speaking of the Wheel in Space, number 3. Number 3 is The Wheel in Space. This is a odd one of the season, because it introduces Zoe, so this is the only one without Victoria. There's another oddity story coming up, but it's for a different reason. This story is, like I said, I wasn't certain whether this one should be 4th or 3rd, but I eventually, after watching the story, was like, you know what, it's fine at 3rd. I think it's a good story. I think it's pretty decent. It's got some fun stuff. I think it's more deserving of the 6-part broadcast length than the Web of Fear, but I do think it ought to be more 5-parters. But that being said, you lose that actually quite interesting first episode where not much happens, but it's still pretty interesting, which is odd for an episode like that where nothing much happens. I basically berated the Ice Warriors for such a thing. Yeah, but it was actually interesting enough for me to say, actually, maybe can we keep it after all? It was actually pretty good. And actually also make me want to see if we could have a 2-part story like that, where the Doctor and Jamie just trying to solve a mystery on an abandoned ship. Yeah, it would probably be interesting if they could throw an interesting mystery into the mix. I don't think the mystery is quite solved, though. We just know that the Cybermen hijacked it. That's all. But it doesn't reveal anything else. But it's still a very good story. That's very... it's a great job. I've just reviewed this story before doing this ranking, so go check it out for more thoughts, and the same for the other reviews. But I'll just quickly say it's a very good story that does some very good stuff. It's not perfect, but it's still pretty good. Still really good. And now, the best 2 stories of the season. These 2 are, well, one of them is almost perfect, and the other one is perfect besides some little issues with of the time. So number 2, Matthew or Matt Moyer will be happy to see this story here. He'd probably prefer it to be at number 1, but he'll be at least happy to know it's number 2. And that is The Enemy of the World. Holy moly, this is a great story. And it keeps going up in my opinion, like the film Alien. It keeps going up in my opinion. So in this one's case, I did like it, but I didn't think I loved it. I did prefer Web of Fear to begin with when they first came out, or when I got them at least. Then a couple of rewatches afterwards, I changed my mind. I thought this one was better. I thought it was more fun. Whilst Web of Fear wasn't quite as good, but it was still pretty good. And we've come to here where I do like the Web of Fear. I think it's pretty great. But Enemy of the World just blows everything else I've talked about out of the water. Although there's still one other story it doesn't blow out the water. We'll get to that. But everything else, and certainly with all the 6-parters of the season, it blows everything out of the water. It's probably one of the best of the longer stories. When I say longer, as in 6 or more parts. So alongside The Chase, Daleks Master Plan, Faceless Ones, and Evil of the Daleks, it's one of the best ones. So, yeah, and maybe throwing Dalek Invasion of Earth as well, because that was also really great. But yeah, Enemy of the World is just perfect. Or near perfect anyway. A few nitpicks and a few personal problems with the story, but otherwise, brilliant. Brilliant. Very much, this is basically Doctor Who done as a Bond film, or at least in the spy thriller element and espionage element at least. I mean, if you want a bit more action, then you pretty much go to John Pertwee's era. Or the TV movie. Well, maybe not as a Bond film, but for more action. But yeah, if you want a more action-packed Bond-esque story, try The Ambassadors of Death. I would say The Ambassadors of Death would be a good example. Could be a good one. Although John Pertwee's Doctor himself is kind of like a Bondian adventure. I think Inferno would also be a good one to check out in that regard. And maybe Invasion of the Dinosaurs. But for a more espionage, Doctor Who Bondy-esque story, then you're pretty much perfect with this one. Not only that, but you've also got an outstanding performance by Patrick Troughton at his best in the entire show, as well as Salamander. Well, to be honest, this is his best performance as Salamander. I think his best performance of the Doctor is in our number 1 pick. But as his best performance overall, because Salamander is in this story, then this is where it is. I think his Doctor is also still really great. I think his number 1, his best Doctor performance at this time is in our number 1 spot. But Patrick Troughton's best performance so far is in this story, but mainly due to being Salamander. So yeah, he does a fantastic job, and the story around him is amazing, and it's executed really well. Victoria is actually a pretty good character in this one, unlike the previous stories we've mentioned, besides possibly the Web of Fear, but the other, and maybe a little in Abominable Snowmen, and We in Space, she wasn't there at all. But, and yeah, I think everyone's just perfect in this story. Like I said, I've had a few problems with it, I mentioned. But overall, I think it's a brilliant and really, really great Doctor Who story I'm glad the whole thing survives. Unlike Web of Fear, which is a disappointment, part 3 still missing, for reasons. But Enemy of the World, this perfect story, is back. Thank God, the best 2 stories are complete. Oh, I guess you can tell what number 1 is then. But yeah, Enemy of the World, just absolutely perfect. Or very nearly anyway. Number 1 is perfect, apart from a couple of typical 1960s mindsets at the time of what the writers and creators were thinking about those days in terms of everyday stuff, you know. But besides that, it's a fantastic story. It's one of my favourites of all time. I just really enjoy this one. Every time I watch it, I just enjoy the whole story. I just enjoy the plot. I enjoy the characters, even though some of them are stereotypes, but they're still acted really well. And some of them, there are some bits that niggle me, like the mild sexism, racism, and stereotypes. But besides that, I'm absolutely fine. I love this story. And this is The Tomb of the Cybermen. Just amazing. It does. You might feel it's a bit slow to start off with, but it's a bit like Wind in Space. It's building up, and the mystery is still really great. It's really interesting, and I would also say the same for Enemy of the World. It's build up really well, and so when you get to the halfway point, or whenever the story decides to change gears and has its big moments, then that's where it becomes really great. And the Cybermen are just amazing in this story, and I even like the voices. So, yeah, in fact, I even had a go at Wind in Space for changing him. So, this story is just absolutely amazing. It's my favourite of the Doctor Who at this point in time of the first 5 seasons. We're going to have lots of other great stories as well. So, candidates for top best Doctor Who story of all time, and there will be ones that are topping, but until 1979 City of Death in season 17... I don't think there's going to be any that tops the Tomb of the Cybermen, in my opinion. There will be plenty of others that will join it in my best and favourite stories of all time, but until 79, until we get to season 17, there's not going to be any that's topping it. Not yet, anyway. So, yeah, Tomb of the Cybermen. I love this story, despite some little annoyances with some of the writings of the time. But you've got to take it for what it was at the time, and I've been trying to do that with each story, but I've also been trying to do them as stories of the show and how they would work in this era as well. And while stories like this, Enemy, Wheel and Web were great, they're brilliant, the other 3 aren't very good. Ice Warriors is dull and boring. I think I could probably see them losing figures over the story. Germany didn't even decided not to pick up the show after watching it, but that was more down to the nice sets and costumes rather than the dull story, although they did find it a bit complicated. And in that case, well, you're missing out, Germany. It's a great show. I don't know if this is... I think this is probably West Germany, by the way. I don't know if East Germany would be watching it in 67, 68. Maybe by 70s or 80s. And certainly by the 90s, the whole of Germany will be watching. They've certainly released some classic Who DVDs out now. I've seen them. I've personally gone and seen them in Germany. This time last year I was in... Well, actually not this time last year. Last year. Anyway, so that's it from my Season 5 ranking. I'll quickly wrap up. Number 7 is, I'm just reminding you, the Ice Warriors. Number 6 is Fury from the Deep. Number 5 is the Abominable Snowmen. Number 4 is the Web of Fear. Number 3 is the Wheel in Space. Number 2, the Enemy of the World. And number 1 is the Tomb of the Cybermen, which is the number 1 story of all time at this moment for me. Okay, so Season 5. Okay, that was a bit of a divisive and kind of a mixed bag story. It had more positives than negatives, but it was kind of a very divisive story. I think Season 4 was a bit more of a positive season than this one, with 5 out of 9 being brilliant. Well, 2 being pretty good and 2 being poor, whilst this one it had 4 great, 4 best, great or better, and 3 weaker, pretty weak stories. But next season we're also going to get a very divisive story, because we've got some really some really terrible stories next season, alongside some really great ones. So yeah, tune in for my reviews of Doctor Who Season 6, starting of course with one of the worst stories of all time, The Dominators. Well, I think it's one of the worst stories of all time. It certainly is one of the worst of Patrick Troughton's and one of the worst of the 60s. So I wouldn't be surprised if it was one of the worst of all time. So yeah, I'll see you in that review, but as for Season 5, that's it, we're finished. About time too, I was getting a bit tired, but not as much as the other season, because there was less stories, and that's something we're going to be looking forward to when we get to John Pertwee's era. Less stories, although the Doctor Who guy, that time recording, did make a video about how there's less stories, and he's getting a bit annoyed about that. So if we had something like in the 70s and 80s, it wouldn't be too bad, or maybe like the 2005s to 10s, or 10s to 14. Oh well, anyway. But anyways, season 5 finished. And now we can finally move on to Patrick Troughton's final season, season 6. And see how that fares. Okay, that's it from me. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye. Don't forget to click below to subscribe to the official Nicholas Payne Retro YouTube channel. I knew I'd do that as soon as I started. It's not even that great. It's not even fun enough to be enjoyability. Fuck me. And this is one that's not even enjoyable. But if it was enjoyability, oh, I'm muddling my enjoy word up again. Excuse me. I'll just be a moment. Anyway, speaking of the Wii, I basically just fuck. Is Matt Moore? Fuck. Matt Moyer. Matthew Moyer or Matt Moyer